Welcome to Rick's Europe. Today we'll be discussing tariffs, probably the most heard word of the past month. Because what do the tariffs actually imply, and what is the reason that Trump is imposing them? I think one of the things that is really interesting is that it's not a new thing. Actually, Obama was a big fan of the tariffs, and strangely enough, liberals were not against it back then, but now that Trump wants to impose them, it's a big drama. Well, let's deep dive into it and get a better understanding of what's actually going on. And to do so with me today is Andrew Muller. He is the chief of operator of the Liberty Sentinel. Andrew, thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thank you, Scarlett. It's a pleasure to be here.
You know, in Europe, what is really lacking is a nuanced debate about why those tariffs are actually being imposed. You know, what is the real reason behind it? Could you please help us understand it better? You know, what is the real reason Trump is imposing these tariffs?
Well, it's really simple, actually. And you mentioned the Democrats, and just a footnote, they are for tariffs historically. We've got clips of Senate Majority and Minority Leader back and forth. Chuck Schumer talking about tariffs for decades. He's been in the United States Senate forever. He said tariffs are a good thing. Nancy Pelosi, who's in the United States House of Representatives, who's been a Democrat majority and minority leader on and off, has also been a big fan of tariffs. Obama. And these are things that have been said by the Democrats forever because the United States' full history leading back to the founding fathers actually embraced tariffs. And I was reading a little bit of history about this recently because it's just so important. That actually our beloved president, George Washington, who I admire very much, he was a big fan of tariffs. Actually, the second law he signed into law was the Tariff Act of 1789. It was proposed by James Madison, who's dubbed the founder of our U.S. Constitution. George Washington signed that bill into law. It was the second one he ever signed, which imposed a 5% import or duty or tariff on goods coming into the United States. So this isn't a new concept. It's been around for a long time. The United States has had tariffs up to 90% for various countries across our history of 250 plus years. And this is something that the president is doing now, fast forward to 2025, because we haven't had reciprocal tariffs. We haven't weaponized or utilized perhaps this very useful tool to our advantage. And we've allowed countries like China, Vietnam, the European Union to really harass us with tariffs that they put on us up to 80%, up to 70%, big numbers. And yet we respond with little to nothing. So they have massive access to our market, the biggest market in the world, and they get to do that for really little to no cost. And then if we want to export something to them, we have to pay out the nose. So what the president has done is he's done this, what he calls kind tariff or reciprocal tariff. And it's not even reciprocal because it's not matching it. It's in some cases less than half of what we're being given by other countries. So for China, they're imposing a 67% tariff on the United States. We respond with a 34% tariff. So we're not even matching what the Chinese are putting on us. This is a very kind, very gracious response to what has been a series of catastrophic abuses to the United States. And really, China is what it is because of the United States. The guy who's pictured behind me, Richard Nixon there, he opened up the U.S. market to China. That was a very controversial move at the time. But the reason Nixon opened up the U.S. market to China was because he didn't want them to fall into the hands of the Chinese, or into the Russians, excuse me, and aid the Russians' Cold War against the United States. So he said, if we can open up our markets to China, have a friendly relationship to them, that will keep them from falling into the hands of the Soviet Russians, and then we will be able to win this Cold War. Now, later, Bill Clinton, the husband of Hillary Rodham Clinton, gave China favored nation status and elevated their trade relationship with the United States to a very unrighteous and unreasonable standard, and they became the powerhouse they are today. But to recognize that China is what it is today because of the United States is a very important point. And for us to impose about half of a tariff compared to what they're putting on us is not tyrannical, is not unreasonable, because China doesn't follow their rules. They don't play nice. They take advantage of us. There's no win in the current situation for us. So something had to change. And the tariff was a safe, historically sound, observable action that we could look at over the course of multiple centuries and see how it worked. And in the United States, it's been a very successful tactic. So I think what the president has done is smart. Of course, there's going to be backlash to it because everything he does, there's backlash to. It's not going to be a smooth ride per se, but I think in the long run, it's worth it.
You know, what you're saying is, thank you for sharing the perspective, because I think it also is really in line with actually Trump. Trump is doing exactly what he promised. He's putting America first. He's protecting American interests by imposing those tariffs. It's restoring the trade balance, which is fair, let's be honest. It's helping to also support local jobs. It's going to make sure that production is coming closer to home. And I think, you know, this is very interesting because actually, when you think about it, because of tariffs, we will be forced to produce more at home, right? So, you know, for the Greens, you could say that because you are going to produce more at home, there will be less emissions, something that they love, that they are the ones criticizing it. And I'm trying to make sense of it, but I just simply can't. And also, like you said during your answer, this is an idea that has been embraced by liberals, by the left for so long. And now that Trump is doing it, out of the sudden, he's the bad guy. What's your take on that?
And that's an important point, Scarlett, about bringing things back to countries and making them there, because that's nationalist in nature, right? If countries are able to be supportive of themselves, right, to be able to be self-sufficient, let's say, then that is a big hindrance to international global governance, right? So if the United States is very dependent on the European Union, for example, if we're very dependent upon the Chinese for all these products that we consume, our pharmaceuticals or our chips, we're very dependent on Taiwan for our computer chips and processing technologies and things like that, then that makes us more susceptible to the international guidelines, let's say, or international relations. But if we were self-sufficient, if we were able to do for ourselves, then we would be able to be more sovereign. So there's definitely a nationalist, globalist tension here, where if Donald Trump says, hey, we're going to do tariffs, we're going to be protectionist, we're going to try to bolster production at home, that obviously removes leverage from the globalists to be able to control us. And Thomas Jefferson, who was a great American president, he was the author of the Declaration of Independence, which is our national birth certificate. He said on April 6th of 1816 this regarding tariffs, which speaks to exactly what you said. He said, it may be that the duty of all to submit to this sacrifice to pay for a time an impost, right, that's a tariff, on the importation of certain articles, goods, in order to encourage their manufacture at home. So what Thomas Jefferson said there over 200 years ago was that Americans might have to sacrifice a little bit, maybe pay a little bit more, maybe go without a Lululemon bag, for example, for a while we make things in the United States. And that is a positive. And in the United States, we've delegated far too much to China. We've delegated far too much to Europe. We've delegated far too much to the Japanese. Our automobile industry is a great example of that. Almost every middle-class American drives either a Honda, a Nissan, or a Toyota. These are foreign-made cars. Ford, for example, once a titan of the motor industry in the United States, they no longer make sedans, for example. They no longer make vans. They've totally cut that out. They only do trucks and like commercial style vehicles. They still have the Mustang, which is a classic muscle car, but that's not a family car by any stretch of the imagination. So they've done away with that. Same with Chevy. Chevy really doesn't make any sort of vans or for sedans that families would use. Now they turn to Honda, they turn to Toyota. These are foreign owned and operated companies. So we've become far too dependent on other people. And I'm a free trader, right? If another country can make something and it's better and we can access it and that's a good deal, I'm fine with that. But what I'm not fine with is American manufacturing being squelched due to overregulation, due to socialistic style policies, to the point where companies have to be able to make a profit, ship their factories, ship their manufacturing over to China or to Japan. And that started under Democrat rule. It started under Woodrow Wilson. It started under Franklin Delano Roosevelt during World War I and World War II. Income tax was imposed upon the American people through the 16th Amendment to the United States Constitution. All of this regulation and taxation that came from the federal government forced business owners to move manufacturing across the seas to be able to avoid some of these regulations, and that is why we've had this overdependence. So something has to change. The tariff is, in my opinion, the only way to make that happen. And tariffs on China are nothing new. For the United States as well, we have a history of tariffs, but we also have a history of tariffs against China. Your viewers might be familiar with George Washington Carver. He's a very famous African-American inventor. He was the fella who invented a whole bunch of stuff from the peanut, very prolific scientist and historical figure. He actually testified to Congress, the Ways and Means Committee, saying that he wanted the United States government to impose a tariff on China on peanuts, because he was very big into researching peanuts, creating various products out of peanuts, and the peanuts being imported from China were hindering his business and also the other people who were in the United States Peanut Growers Association. So Congress ended up actually imposing tariffs on the Chinese regarding their peanut importation. And that's a kind of an absurd, very small example. But it does show that at least 100 years ago, that was in the 1920s, that the United States has, in an effort to protect American industry, imposed a tariff upon the Chinese, and it worked.
That's a great example. And I really want to go to another example, not just peanuts, but also Lululemons. And there's one thing that I really love about this whole situation. Don't judge me. I know people will judge me. I am on TikTok, and my TikTok is filled with videos of manufacturers in China who are saying, if you want to buy Lululemon, don't go to the middleman, come to us. They're exposing the real prices of production of all these big brands like Dior and Chanel and Hermes. Like, you can now go to the manufacturer and buy an Hermes bag that's usually worth like 40,000-50,000 euros. And you have to wait years to get one. You can buy it now for 1,000 euros. I think a lot of people are actually benefiting from it. You have to give the Chinese that they're creative in that sense. And I want to talk about the dependence, as you mentioned. And I think it became painfully visible during COVID. It was really, China was really using that as a tool to do whatever they want with us, because we were so dependent on them. The government was forcing us to have masks, to have the medicines. And I think it really showed, we cannot have China producing everything, because they will use it as a power against us. We need to bring more production back home so we are not dependent on China. And this is one of the fears that a lot of people are facing in Europe, to be honest with you, because they are thinking that Trump imposing those tariffs is pushing us more towards China. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I just think that it's this kind of left-wing pandering that says, okay, because President Trump's doing it, now it's wrong. It's like we started this conversation off with the Democrats, where, some things in life are purely political, right? But there are also some things that are just super black and white, okay? Right. And this issue of tariffs is, in my opinion, one of those apolitical issues where it's like Democrats and Republicans over the course of the United States history, at least, have all mutually, recognized that tariffs are a very practical economic tool to stimulate growth at home and to be able to ward off, let's say, foreign economic abuse. So that's something that has been a kind of an ironclad, at least American political economic opinion for the better part of 2 centuries. But now, because Donald Trump is doing it, it's bad, it's horrible, it's this, it's that, it's the other. But the results also speak for themselves, too. Multiple countries, and multiple is an understatement, I think it's getting close to 100, have come to President Trump and said, okay, let's negotiate the tariffs. Let's figure this out. Let's, end this madness and not get into a trade war. The most horrible or the most egregious player in this game has been China. They responded with the upping of tariffs. I forget the percentage, but it was large. And then Trump came back and he's like, okay, how's 125% sound? And all of that was to be expected. But, you mentioned Lululemon, for example. Lululemon's made in China, but it's also made in Vietnam. That's a big manufacturer of Lululemon. And Vietnam was imposing a 90% tariff on the United States. I mean, that's insane. A 90% tariff on the United States. We responded to that with a 46% tariff. And I partly can't blame them. We had the Vietnam War and we went in there and tore things up. And, I'm not a big fan of how the Vietnam War went down. So there's some hard feelings there between us and them, and rightly so. But 90% tariff is pretty crazy, and to then scoff at 46% in retaliation, to me, is just nonsensical. So I think all of this does come down to why the hatred from the left, why the hatred from people who oppose America first and who oppose Trump. And I really do think it is that globalist nationalist dichotomy. I really do believe that's what it comes down to. Because what's the alternative to tariffs? Well, we just keep doing what we've been doing. Well, what has doing what we've been doing produced? Well, it's produced an overproductive United Nations, an overproductive European Union. It's brought rise to things like BRICS. It's brought rise to an international community that looks at the United States as a polluter, as an aggressor, as a cancer upon the world, even though we are the ones who are really falling on our own sword repeatedly when it comes to trade, when it comes to the climate agenda, when it comes to these things. So for us to be dependent upon other nations, for us to not recognize our own strength, for us to not become doers and to be able to take responsibility, that the lack of that enables the globalist. It enables the globalist to take control of America. And when we fight back and we say, no, we're going to put our country first, we're going to manufacture at home, it really throws a wet blanket on the globalist movement. And there are moves right now to try to subvert this. For example, the United Nations, right? This is a little bit of a rabbit hole, but you'll see how it's relevant. They get most of their funding from the United States. There's like 192 or 193 member countries in the UN. We pay a third of the budget out of all of that. It's insane. And we host it in New York City in a very nice, extraordinarily expensive part of town in New York. I've been there.
Literally
and
the heart of Manhattan.
Yes, in the heart of Manhattan. It's a very nice piece of property. They get to live there and do their business while we pay a third of the funds for the United Nations. If we were to withdraw, let's say, or if we were even to cut our funding by 50%, they would be completely cut at the knees. They'd be completely neutered. They wouldn't be able to do what they've been doing. So right now, the United Nations is trying to impose a shipping tax. This is an extraordinarily large story that hardly anyone's covering. And we've covered it at the New American Magazine, at the Liberty Sentinel, where now you have the UN really in tandem with this whole tariff discussion that the president is having, trying to get a direct source of revenue from the world through a shipping tax. And to me, that screeches of desperateness, right? Because they know that the United States is starting to wake up. We're starting to reclaim our sovereignty. And if we are not going to be abused by the international community, then we might look at the UN and say, hey, maybe you're abusing us as well as an entity. Maybe you shouldn't be headquartered in New York. Maybe we shouldn't pay a third of your budget. So now they're starting to look to other sources of revenue, like this global shipping tax they want to do, which, by the way, if they were able to pull off, would fund their globalism in perpetuity, and they wouldn't need to go to governments to ask for money. They'd just be able to get the money from the shipping tax. So that's extraordinarily dangerous. But the plus side of it is that they're desperate. They're looking for new ways of funding because this sleeping giant of the United States has started to wake up. So it's going to be painful for the U.S. and our citizens for a while. Prices probably will go up. But my response to that is, what's the alternative? To have lower prices or keep prices the same, which are already high, for maybe another 5-10 years, and then just be serfs and be slaves to China for all of our products, for our pharmaceuticals, for all these different things. I'd rather have a little bit of discomfort right now with the long-term benefit of being free.
That is such a good analysis. And I think it's so great that you're pointing that out. What is the alternative? And what is also like, what will our future look like if we don't shift direction? And that's exactly what I wanted to talk about with you on the last question, because we have Giorgia Meloni coming to Washington. She's actually, she said the most important thing is that we have a good relationship with the United States. She's going there directly to talk with Donald Trump about a tariff deal between Italy and the United States. And I applaud that. I think this is the most beautiful gift that Trump is giving us. Even though he's an American president, he's really doing a favor for the European people, because he is making Europe sovereign again. This is exactly what we need, because now countries are being forced to actually do bilateral trade with the United States. Unfortunately, not everyone in Europe understands that, because we've got still establishment parties that abuse this opportunity to say that we need to have an united Europe. And honestly, there's not a worse horror scenario for me than a united Europe.
Yeah.
But it's really showing us two possible outcomes. Either the globalists win and we will go towards an European or united Europe for our European watchers, or it's going to really shift the political playing field and we go back to as the world should be, and that is that you've got sovereign nations trading together. What do you think the outcome will be at the end, Andrew? Realistically.
The outcome for Europe or the outcome for America?
Both.
Both? Okay. Well, I'm far more optimistic for America. I think that, there's really two end goals here, two possible endings. And I'm not an economist. I'm not the most competent on these issues, but just from the knowledge I have, this is the way I see it, that either the tariffs work and these countries come back to Trump and they say, okay, we get it. We've been too extreme. We'll be fair. We'll cut our tariffs down by, let's just say 50%. Which is already happening, by the way. Israel said that, Vietnam has said that. Looks like Italy's going to say that. Ursula von der Leyen kind of hinted that she was open to negotiations. So I think that is a possible outcome, right? That these countries come back, they cut the tariffs, and we get a good result. The main thing is China, right? So what will China do? That is the one that's really sticky. I think that China views the United States is a complete enemy, that they're complete war with us, not militarily, but economically, they're in complete warfare with us. And my hunch is they're not going to roll over without a fight. So I think that what's going to happen is they're probably going to make things fairer, but they're not going to make things completely right because they're a communist dictatorship. They're completely opposed to the United States ideologically on every single front. In some senses, they've infiltrated our country through buying farmland, through corrupting the Democratic Party, through owning massive parts in social media companies, and they really have a foothold here. So back to the two various outcomes of this. One, we get a fair deal, at least with a big part of the world, but China ends up still fighting us, and we get into an economic war with China to the point where potentially we have to cut off massive ties with them, which the implications of that would be pretty severe for them and for us. Or two, this is the optimistic path. The tariffs work, China backs down, and then this is the big thing. The United States eliminates income tax. Now, when you say that, people may be like, okay, what's the big deal? But if the United States were to eliminate income tax, the 16th Amendment to the United States Constitution, it's been in play for on and off close to a century. If we were to eliminate that, the federal government in the United States would be so reined in economically that there would have to be such drastic cuts. Tariffs would have to be imposed. We'd have to go back to the early 1900s style where we got most of our federal budget from imposts. And then if that happened, we'd have a more limited government, a more entrepreneurial citizenry. we'd have more free trade with other nations, and then we'd have economic prosperity and everyone would hold hands and sing kumbaya. So that's what I'm hoping happens. What I'm hoping happens is the tariff works. China backs down at least to the point where we can label it as a temporary victory. The United States gets rid of income tax. And this isn't a fever dream or pipe dream. President Trump has actually said everything I'm saying. He's said through Howard Lutnick, our Commerce Secretary, that the end goal is to eliminate the 16th Amendment and get rid of income tax. So if this actually happens, which is the current position of the Trump administration, then I think the United States would have an economic boom, a real estate boom, a steel boom, an oil boom, a automobile boom that would be so big through the deregulation, the ability of Americans to keep more of their own paycheck, that the potential danger of China ramping up their economic war wouldn't be as big of a deal. But if we don't repeal the income tax, if we don't deregulate, if we don't pass the tax cuts, then what's going to happen is we're just going to get in a trade war with China. They're going to inflate prices. They're not going to back down. We're already too neutered and dependent. And then we'll maybe hit something approximating a recession or a depression. So if that happens, that's obviously bad news. But if the United States Congress can get their act together and deregulate and pass tax cuts, particularly getting rid of the 16th Amendment, I think the economic boom that would cultivate across the whole United States would be so significant that it wouldn't necessarily matter as much what China did in a retaliatory nature. So that's positive because it's, giving the really decision making to the American people. But as for Europe, I think that Europe is going to have a massive come to Jesus moment, if you will. Yeah. The way I see it in Europe right now is that there are definitely areas of nationalism and sovereigntism arising, but writ large, the people there are still indoctrinated through the schools, they're still indoctrinated through the media, and there's not a grassroots fire to upend the system, if you will. So I think that what Trump is doing is positive, but as long as the European people stay asleep to the realities of the deep state and they don't revolt, and I'm not calling for violence, but if they don't revolt against what's going on in Romania or what's going on in France, for example, with the elections, it's just going to be the same old, same old.
Well, let's pray we'll all be singing Kumbaya in the end. Andrew,
Yes.
Thank you so much for sharing all of your insights. I really want to know more about what you're writing, and I know our viewers would like to follow you as well. What's the best way to follow your work?
Oh, thank you. You can go to thelibertysentinel.org, and you can also go to thenewamerican.com, and there you'll be able to find my writings and my work.
Yes, because, Andrew, it takes a lot of bravery to speak out against deep state. So I really appreciate you for it. I know our viewers do as well. I want to thank you so much for being here on the show. And of course, thank you to our viewers at home.